Hello everybody, the next plane off the pile is the Stanley number 37. Let's take a look at it. The number 37 is a bit of an oddball. It's shorter than a traditional jack plane and it's significantly wider. It's the same width as the number 8. It's called the Jenny plane and nobody really knows why. There's an excellent website called Patrick's Blood and Gore. It's one of my favorites. Patrick Leach has a theory on why it's called the Jenny plane. In that theory, if the jack plane was named after a jackass, then the Jenny plane must be named after the female donkey, which they refer to as a Jenny. At least that's the story. Nobody knows if it's true. This old Jenny has had years of neglect. It's time to see what's underneath it all, so let's break it down. And while the breakdown may have looked smooth, it wasn't all that smooth. Lots of rust. Screws like this one right here become really difficult to remove. All these parts are in need of some TLC. The frog was tough. The depth adjustment knob is rusted solid, so the whole thing I took out of the back of the frog. And the cap screw that you see right there goes in the hole at the bottom of the frog. I had to use the torch to heat the bottom of the frog up to get the cap screw out. It was rusted in solid. So a little bit of work left to do there. I was happy to see that the depth adjustment has patent dates in it and there's a solid nut for the tote. That means this is an older number 37, so I'm going to have to figure out just how old she is. To free up this depth adjustment nut, I put some oil on it. Locked it between two pieces of oak on my vise, applying heat, and any kind of luck, it's going to turn off. And there it is, heat works. The alternatives aren't good. You lock a pair of vice grips onto that, try to turn it off, you're going to mess up the brass. I've decided this job is going to be a preservation and not a restoration because of the age of the plane, and it's a collectible, has some value to it. So we're going to see how well this goes, not knowing what's underneath. So the first thing I want to do is clean up the wood. I'm going to use a sanding sponge, fine grit, and some steel wool to kind of clean off the mess. First hit it with the air hose to blow the crud off, and whatever lacquer's underneath I want to try to preserve it. So after a very light sanding and steel wooling, that's as much as I'm going to do to these wooden parts. The staining that came with time, it's part of this plane now. The darkening of that knob, all of that is earned by this plane. Part of the originality that I'm not going to take away. I started with the wood parts first so I could start working some oil and wax into them. This mixture of stuff right here, feed and wax. So that's going to be the start of rejuvenating this finish. Over the last 100 years or so, the wood's dried out, and before I put any wax over top of it, I want to make sure I get some moisture back into it as much as I can. Some planes, like a number 35 Type 2, I've been working on for maybe 4 months right now, of just oiling the wood because it's got cracks in it and I'm trying to close them up. And with the generous coat of oil applied, it's going to sit for a while, and I'm going to repeat a process. It's going to soak in. I can already see it soaking in. I'm going to steel wool it with some 3/0 steel wool and repeat the oil steel wool as many times as I can while I'm working on the rest of the parts. So next, all these metal parts, I'm going to scrub them with some simple green and a scrub brush, rinse them off and blow them off with some air. Give me a better idea of what they're going to look like. And while they do look better cleaned off, they don't look that much better. And I've also applied a second coat of oil. Next thing I want to do is use one of my homemade scrapers, and wherever there's a flat metal surface, I'm going to start removing the rust with a scraper. I'm going to do it in a way that I want to leave patina if I can. And after scraping, these parts are looking a lot better. You can now see the trademark on the iron, marks on the iron cap, and looking at the back side, I did the lateral, I did the cap iron. You don't scrape the back side of the iron cap because it's Japan. I'm going to steel wool that, and there's the back side of the iron. Next, I'm going to hit those same pieces with the sanding sponge and some steel wool. I ended up adding a couple more tools to that list, the dental pick and those wire brushes. Dental pick gets into the little nooks and crannies where the other tools don't. Wire brushes are really good to use. If the Japanning is going to stay, it's going to stay. The wire brushes don't take it off. So 100% better. Machine surfaces are looking really good. Leading edge of the lever cap. The iron cap's looking real good. And I want to show you what leaving patina does. So right there on that iron, you can see where the iron cap used to be, where it sat for 100 years. You can't fake that kind of stuff, and that's the heritage of the plane that it's earned, and it's going to stay. Likewise, on the back side of the iron, there's where it sat on the frog. There's where the lever cap was resting for a very long time. And I was happy to see that the only pitting on this thing is on the back side, where it's not going to matter. So overall, these parts cleaned up quite well. Next thing I want to do is finish the iron cap, and that's the steel wool the back side of it. And then I'm going to kind of tune up the front edge a little bit on my lapping station. And here's a look at it after the steel wool. And with that edge tuned up, I did just enough to where it makes a solid contact with the iron all the way across that leading edge. Next, I'm going to clean up the Japanning. There's the tools, soft wire brush, steel wool. What I'm going to do is get the rust off. Places like that right there, around all the edges, being careful not to mess up any of the Japanning. And here's what the parts look like after I've removed the rust. Now, as you can see, it's not perfect. You can see some staining left there, but all that's going to disappear with the dirty oil rag. Here's the lever cap. What I've done is I've removed the gross crusting of rust from all the parts. Next thing to do is to unleash the dirty oil rag. I'm going to coat every nook and cranny of these Japan parts. And the dirty oil is going to stay on until I'm done with everything else. I added a third coat, steel wool first, and then more oil on the wooden parts. And the next thing I'm going to do is clean up the small parts, because they're definitely in need of a good cleaning. Small parts are done, and I did a third and fourth coat of wire brushing and not dirty oil, but good oil on the wood parts. I finished the back side of the iron, concentrating down towards that lower edge. And I trued up the end of the iron, put a 25-degree bevel on it, and sharpened it to a razor edge. Then I dirty oiled the iron and the iron cap, and now everything is coated with dirty oil, with the exception of small parts. They've been lubricated and wiped off, and now everything needs to be wiped off and waxed. Wax on, wax off, and all that's left to do is put this old plane together and give it a test drive. But look at the difference. The wood is looking really good. That plain bottom right there, the metal part, the way it looked to start with, just all rust. It's still got a large part of the original Japanning on it, and the bare parts don't look all that bad because the metal's dark. Small parts look good. Tote and knob have got a nice sheen, and they feel real good in your hand. The lever cap, it was a rust bucket, and that's original Japanning on it. Frog, I want to point out something on the frog that's interesting. If you look, you can see the machining at the top and the bottom, and that's it. And that's the way it was made originally. The pour from the foundry, it must have been a little bit short, or that's the way they made them, but that's where the machining was. They got a nice patina on the iron cap and the iron. So time to put the old Jenny back together. And what a difference. The old Jenny's looking really good. It amazes me to think that about 128 years ago somebody walked into a hardware store and they paid $4.50 for this Jenny plane. Today's book value for a Jenny is between $300 and $450. That's amazing. This plane is a Type 9 made somewhere between 1884 and 1888. Doing the preservation instead of the restoration turned out really nice. Got a plane with lots of character. I wonder what the story is behind the plane. Old W.C. Fritzinger. It's got prominently marked a couple places on both sides of the plane. Was he the first person to buy it? Was it him that walked into the store almost 130 years ago and paid that $4.50? The places this plane has been and the wood that it shaved. We'll never know. But we are going to find out how well it still shaves wood 128 years later. It's time to take this old Jenny for a test drive. And here she goes. While she glides over like butter, it's clear the iron is sharp. The old Jenny's got a problem. And that is the bottom is not true. Right about where the throat is, it rocks. That's an easy fix, but I'm not going to do it on an old collectible like this one here. With about another 5 minutes work on my lapping station, I could have the bottom of this plane trued up and it would work spectacular. The iron is razor sharp and she's ready to go. But because this is a valuable old collectible and I went to all this effort to keep it in original-like condition, I did a preservation instead of a restoration. That would be too much into the restoration and lap the bottom. You'd make the wood on the bottom look like brand new, and that's not what I want. The amount of wood that would have to come off the bottom of this plane would be minimal. And even though the bottom's not true, I call this a success. I took that old plane from the grave and brought it back to life. I think the preservation of this old Jenny was a success. It turned out to be a really nice looking plane. I'm happy with it. I hope it goes to a good home and somebody else will either put it on a shelf or true up the bottom and put it back to use. Who knows what's next off the pile, we're going to have to see, but not now because it's time for supper. Bye.